Vivian stood at the kitchen sink, slowly stirring sugar into a cup of coffee. Outside, a drizzle was falling, trickling down the window in lazy drops, and it seemed as if nature itself was doing everything to intensify her feeling of melancholy. She threw the spoon onto the table with a loud clatter that broke the silence and turned to Jessica, sitting at the kitchen island. Honestly, if I had known that being married would be so boring, I would have stayed in the girls' club forever, Vivian declared, raising her cup and taking a sip that scalded her lips. Miles, he's he's like furniture, useful but no inspiration. Jessica looked up from her phone, her eyebrows arched in a mix of surprise and interest. She had known Vivian long enough not to take her words seriously. Are you serious right now? Jessica asked, smiling slightly. Viv, is it really that bad? Vivian snorted, leaning on the table. He sits on the couch with his ESPN and doesn't even notice when I walk by. Even arguing with him is boring. Everything is predictable. Work, dinner, his pointless attempts to make me laugh with stupid jokes. If I had to do it all over again, Jess, I swear, I wouldn't even look in his direction. Jessica squinted, trying to gauge how serious these words were. You're not serious, right? Miles isn't that bad. He's caring and... Caring? Vivian interrupted with a sneer, throwing up her hands. Caring is a dog, Jessica, and I need a man. If that's all marriage has to offer, I'd rather be alone. She laughed, but her laughter was loud and harsh, like the sound of broken glass. However, before Jessica could respond, a strange sound came. A movement behind her. A heavy, agonizingly long silence filled the room. Vivian froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She slowly turned her head. Miles stood in the doorway. His tall silhouette seemed darker against the gray light of the rain outside the window. In his hands, he held keys that jingled when his fingers involuntarily clenched. Miles's face was devoid of any expression. No anger, no pain, no contempt. Only a bottomless emptiness in his eyes. Miles! Her voice barely broke through the silence. He raised his hand, making her fall silent. His movements were so slow and detached that it took her breath away. He approached the table, put down the keys, and with one smooth motion, threw his jacket over his shoulders. You heard that? Vivian whispered, but Miles did not answer. His gaze, still detached, slid over her as if she were a stranger. This was not her Miles, not the one she knew. He turned, headed for the door, and left, leaving only the sound of the door slamming shut behind him. She stood frozen, holding the cup in her hands as if the world had suddenly lost its colors. What the hell was that? Vivian finally whispered, turning to Jessica, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Jessica just shook her head, her eyes wide open. You just destroyed your husband in a few sentences, Viv. And he heard it. Those words, like a knife, pierced her heart. Vivian felt her lips start to tremble. Oh, come on, he's just being dramatic. She tried to convince herself, but her voice sounded weaker than she expected. He'll be back. An hour? 2. Max. But deep down, something in her already knew. She had taken the first step into an abyss from which there might be no way back. 2 hours passed. Then 3. By midnight, the house was drowned in silence, which pressed on her chest like an overly heavy blanket. Vivian sat on the couch, hugging her knees as if trying to keep herself from falling apart. Her phone vibrated on the coffee table, but she couldn't bring herself to pick it up. Calm down, she muttered to herself, looking at the TV screen where a meaningless news rerun was playing. He's just mad, that's all. She reached for her phone to check if he had written. Empty. Instead, her fingers froze over the keyboard. Write? Call? Apologize? No, she said aloud, throwing the phone back. Why should I apologize? But her confidence was fragile, like thin ice. She knew she had made a mistake. This realization was slow, viscous, like a thick fog that enveloped her thoughts. Vivian never thought he could leave. Miles had always been the one who stayed, the one who endured her outbursts of irritation, sarcasm, barbs that she sometimes let slip more for effect than for meaning. He forgave her, even when she knew she was wrong. He'll be back, she tried to convince herself again and again. But time passed and her confidence waned. Maybe you should just text him, suggested Jessica, who was still there, sitting in the corner of the couch with her phone in her hands. Her voice was calm, almost lazy, but there was concern in her gaze. Text? Vivian raised her eyebrows as if this suggestion was absurd. And say what? Sorry I said what I feel. Jessica sighed, looking at her friend with slight disapproval. You understand that he didn't just hear Viv. He felt it. It wasn't just a bad joke. You literally shattered his belief that he means something to you. These words hit harder than Vivian expected. She turned away to hide the trembling of her lips. It's not like that, she breathed, looking at her crossed hands. I didn't mean... I was just angry. But who was she trying to convince? Jessica or herself? When Jessica left, leaving her alone with the silence, Vivian felt panic gradually filling her entire being. She paced from corner to corner like a trapped animal, repeatedly replaying in her mind the words she had said and the expression on Miles's face when he heard them. It doesn't mean anything, she whispered to herself. People say stupid things. It doesn't make them monsters. But inside, something else was rising. Uncertainty. She couldn't shake the thought. Maybe she really was the monster in their relationship. She remembered how often she brushed off his attempts to talk, how she took his care for granted. I do love him, right? She asked herself, but the answer was not as simple as she would have liked. By morning, despair had become almost unbearable. Her thoughts jumped from one extreme to another, from anger, how could he just leave, to guilt. What if I really broke him? She checked her bank account, hoping to find some clue. A moment later, her gaze froze. The screen showed a debit, a motel an hour's drive from their home. Damn it, Mile, she muttered, grabbing the keys. Her car sped through the empty morning streets, rain pounding on the windshield. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her fingers turned white. We'll talk, she said to herself. I'll explain everything to him. But when she entered the motel lobby and faced the indifferent receptionist, her confidence crumbled again. Excuse me, she began, trying to speak calmly. My husband Miles stayed here. I'm sorry, ma'am, we don't disclose information about guests, the receptionist replied with strained politeness. Vivian felt anger rising within her. This is my husband, she exclaimed, slamming her palm on the counter. I have the right to know. But the woman just shrugged. Her last attempt failed. Vivian left the motel, her face wet not only from the rain. She returned home exhausted. Sitting on the couch, she ran her fingers through her hair, which was already sticking to her face. What if he doesn't come back? This thought, which she had been afraid to even entertain, now hung in the air like an inexorable truth. She remembered his face, not anger, not disappointment, but a frightening emptiness. She realized that this was the point of no return, the moment when he stopped believing in their future. And for the first time in her life, Vivian was afraid that she had lost not just a husband, but a part of herself. Now she had to face the most terrifying truth. Miles left not because of one remark. He left because she had long and slowly been destroying their marriage without even noticing it. But the night at the club started as a banal attempt to distract herself. But Vivian, looking in the mirror in her bedroom, felt different. Her face was carefully made up. Dark red lipstick accentuated the lines of her lips, and her dress, shiny, tight, and revealing, looked like armor for a battle she wasn't ready for. You look amazing, Jessica noted, entering the room. Her voice sounded cheerful, but there was something restrained in it, as if she wasn't sure this night was a good idea. Thanks, Vivian tossed out, smoothing her hair. She didn't want to show how much she was shaking inside. Her hand froze on the doorknob. Ready? Ready! The club turned out to be filled with the sounds of loud music, smoke, and flickering lights. People pushed, laughed, moved to the beat of the bass, which seemed to pierce the air. Vivian felt her nervousness dissolve in this chaos. This is exactly what you need, Jessica said loudly, nudging her toward the bar. Let it all go. Vivian nodded uncertainly. She ordered tequila and, downing it in one gulp, felt warmth spread through her body. Loud conversations, bright lights, laughter around her. All of it suddenly felt closer to her than the house where silence awaited her. Within a few minutes, she was already on the dance floor. The bass vibrated under her feet, her movements becoming freer. She tried to convince herself that Miles and her marriage were far behind. And then he appeared. The man approached confidently but not too insistently. Tall, with dark eyes and a slight smirk, he looked like someone who knew how to please. "You look like you don't belong here," he said, leaning closer to be heard over the music. Vivian raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a half-smile. "And you look like you don't care where you are." He laughed, offering her a drink. She nodded, allowing him to order her another tequila. Her heart was pounding. This was a challenge to herself, a way to prove that she was still desired, that she could live without Miles. "I'm Dexter," he said, extending his hand. "Vivian," she replied, her voice sounding confident, even if she was shaking inside. The game began. At first it was just conversation. He made her laugh, told her silly stories, and she responded sarcastically, feeling like the center of attention again. Her body moved to the music, his hand casually touching her waist. "You're dangerous," he said with a smirk, leaning closer. "You have no idea how much," she replied, lifting her head to meet his gaze. And then it happened. A kiss, a moment that started as a joke became something more. His lips touched hers and everything inside her froze. It was bold, wrong, but at that moment she didn't care. She wanted to forget. Forget Miles, her pain, the silence of the house. She wanted to feel alive. When they pulled away, he smiled at her as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're amazing," he said. She smiled, but her heart tightened. When they managed to escape the club, it was well past midnight. Vivian felt like she was on autopilot. Her feet moved, but her mind remained there on the dance floor, in that kiss, in those few hours when she was someone else. "Well?" Jessica asked, glancing at her. "Well, what?" Vivian tried to sound nonchalant, but her voice wavered. "You know it won't help." "I don't need it to help. I need—" She fell silent, unable to find the words. They made it to her house, and Vivian, kicking off her shoes, plopped down on the couch. She looked at her phone. No messages from Miles. She opened her contacts and almost wrote to him, but stopped herself. Instead, a message from Dexter appeared on the screen. "Good morning, Vivian. It was fun. Want to do it again?" She dropped the phone as if it were radioactive. Her body was shaking. "What have I done?" she whispered, covering her face with her hands. She sat in silence, which once again crashed down on the house. Only now it was not just silence, but a heavy realization that she had crossed a line, beyond which there might be no return. She wanted to forget, but instead, she had come even closer to the abyss. Her actions now threatened to destroy everything completely. The only thing left was to wait. But what was she waiting for? Miles's return, or his farewell? Morning was as gloomy as her thoughts. Dull light filtered through the curtains, but Vivian lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her phone vibrated on the bedside table. She knew it was Jessica, probably asking how she felt after last night. Instead of answering, she turned over and closed her eyes, hoping the silence of the house would give her answers. But the silence was only a reminder that Miles still hadn't returned. His appearance was almost a shock. She heard the sound of the opening door, heavy footsteps in the hallway. Her heart stopped. She rushed to the entrance, feeling both relief and anxiety. He stood in the doorway, his face calm but tense. Miles held a sports bag in his hands. This time, everything was different. "Hi," she said softly, trying to sound casual. "Hi," he replied. His voice was neutral, devoid of any emotion. Vivian felt something inside her tremble. He didn't ask how she was, didn't start a conversation. Instead, Miles walked past her, heading to the bedroom. "Miles, wait!" She followed him. "Can we talk?" He stopped at the edge of the bed, dropped the bag on the floor and looked at her. His gaze was heavy, as if he was searching her face for something he hadn't seen there in a long time. "About what?" he asked, crossing his arms. "About us," she replied, her voice trembling. Miles slowly shook his head, his lips twisting into a half-smile that was closer to bitterness than joy. "About us," he repeated. "Interesting. Do you even see anything in us?" "Of course I do." She stepped closer, but he leaned back slightly, as if he didn't want her to be too close. Miles, I know I said terrible things. I shouldn't have. You said what you thought, he interrupted. His voice remained calm, but there was something sharp in it. I heard Vivian. I heard everything. She wanted to argue, but the words caught in her throat. But it's not even about that, he continued, leaning on the back of the bed. It's not just what you said. It's everything that came before. Years, Vivian. Years when you looked at me like I was just a background. That's not true, she breathed, but her voice sounded unconvincing even to herself. It is true. His gaze was heavy. I tried. You know, I even tried not to notice that you no longer wanted this marriage. I told myself it was just a phase. He exhaled and looked away, as if trying to find the strength to continue. But then I realized, you don't want me. You want someone who doesn't exist. These words hit her harder than she expected. Vivian lowered her head to hide her tears, but Miles continued, his voice becoming firmer. And now there's this too. He pointed to her phone lying on the bed. Dexter, her breath caught. It's not what you think, she began, her voice almost a whisper. Then what is it? He picked up the phone and looked at the screen, where the message was still displayed. Is this just a fun night? Just a way to forget? I was angry. She tried to justify herself, feeling her voice break. It means nothing. Miles bitterly smiled. Means nothing? You kissed him, gave him your number. What do you think that means to me? She stepped toward him, trying to take his hand, but he stepped back, his face contorted with pain. Miles, please. Her voice was full of desperation. I love you. Love? He shook his head. You don't even know what that means. His bag was already on his shoulder when he turned to the door. She rushed after him, tears streaming down her cheeks. You can't just leave, she cried. We can fix this. He stopped for a moment, his back tense. Fix? Vivian, I've been trying to fix this for years, and you didn't even notice. His voice wavered, but he didn't turn back. I give up. And with those words he left, leaving her standing in the doorway in silence, which was now unbearably loud. Vivian sank to the floor, pressing her hands to her face. Every corner of the house reminded her of Miles. His cup on the table, his scent on the pillow. She felt the weight of her own mistakes slowly crushing her. She realized this wasn't just a fight, it was the end of everything she knew and the beginning of what she feared most, her loneliness. A month had passed since Miles left. Vivian still couldn't get used to his absence. His absence was like a gaping void in her life. Everything seemed unnaturally quiet, wrong. She tried to live as before, but it was impossible. Every little thing in the house reminded her of him, his favorite chipped mug, his toothbrush she still couldn't throw away, his t-shirt accidentally left in the laundry. She sat on the couch with a cup of cold coffee in her hands, her gaze fixed on one point. The TV was showing some news, but she didn't hear a word. All that occupied her thoughts was the image of Miles, his calm voice, his gaze full of bitterness on that last day. Vivian began to dissect their life piece by piece, trying to understand where it all went wrong. She remembered their first year of marriage, those days when they laughed, cooked dinner together, discussed movies late into the night. Back then she felt happy, but over time everything changed. She began to blame him for trivial things, the way he folded his clothes, his predictability, his lack of ambition. She demanded more from him, but never asked herself what she was doing for their relationship. I killed it, she whispered to herself, clutching the mug so tightly that her fingers turned white. This thought hit harder than Vivian expected. She realized that over the years, she had accumulated so much negativity that she didn't even notice how she started pushing away the person who was trying to love her. One evening, she finally decided to sort through his things. Opening the closet, she saw his shirts neatly hung, as if he were still there. She remembered how often she got irritated when he left them on a chair instead of hanging them up. Now it seemed so petty, so stupid. On the shelf, she found a box of photographs. They laughed, embraced, and took silly selfies. She flipped through the pictures, and each one was like a stab in the heart. In one of them, Miles held her hand, and she looked at him with a smile that she hadn't been able to fake for a long time. "Why didn't I see how hard he was trying?" she asked, looking at their happy faces. Days dragged on slowly. She tried to occupy herself with work, met with Jessica, but all of it seemed meaningless. In her head, she constantly heard his voice from their last conversation. "You don't know what it means to love." These words were like a knife, deeply embedded in her heart. She tried to justify herself. "I loved him. I just didn't know how to show it properly." But the more she thought about it, the clearer she realized that her love was selfish, based on the idea that he should constantly adapt to her. One day, sitting at the kitchen table with a bottle of wine, she mustered the courage and sent him a message. "Miles, I know I'm to blame. I just want you to know, I'm sorry." She hit send and felt her heart tighten. She didn't expect a response. She knew there wouldn't be one. Vivian began to notice changes in herself. Her reflection in the mirror no longer looked confident. Instead of her former arrogance, there was something new in her eyes. Vulnerability. She began to wonder, who was she before she met Miles? Where did that young, hopeful girl go? She signed up for therapy, which was a huge step for her. In her first session, she talked about her mistakes, about how she destroyed her marriage without even realizing it. "I don't want to lose someone again," she said, her voice trembling, "but I'm not sure I know how to be better." The therapist smiled gently. "The first step to change is realizing that you want to change, and you've already taken it." A couple of weeks later, as she was leaving the grocery store, she noticed a familiar figure. Miles was sitting at a table in an outdoor cafe. Across from him was a woman. Dark hair, a light smile, confidence in every movement. Vivian froze. She couldn't look away. He was laughing. His face lit up. She hadn't seen him like that in a long time. Their eyes met. For a moment, she saw surprise in his eyes and then a slight nod. It wasn't an invitation, but a farewell. She understood that he had left, and now his life belonged to him. Vivian stood by the road, her hands trembling. She wanted to approach, say something, but she knew it would be wrong. She slowly turned and walked to her car. At that moment, she realized she had lost him forever. But along with this realization came another. She could start over. Now not for him, but for herself. And perhaps this was her only chance to learn to love truly. 6 months had passed. The spring sun flooded the room with soft light, playing with reflections on the window glass. Vivian sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and a laptop. She had returned to her old hobbies, writing and design, which she once abandoned, thinking they were useless. Now these activities had become her therapy, a way to understand herself. Her home had changed. The walls, which once felt cramped, now had coziness. She rearranged the furniture, threw out unnecessary things, and added live plants that filled the space with life. Every day began with a cup of coffee, but now she drank it not in silence, but to the sound of jazz, which helped her feel alive. Therapy opened her eyes to many things. She realized that all her life she had been waiting for someone else to make her happy. Miles was such a person. He tried as best he could, but it wasn't enough because she herself didn't know how to be happy. Now she was learning to be different, strong, vulnerable, genuine. Her gaze became softer and her heart lighter. She no longer obsessed over being perfect or controlling everything. She allowed herself to be human, with her mistakes, feelings, and weaknesses. One Saturday, Vivian decided to take a walk in the park. She sat on a bench with a book, enjoying the warmth of the sun. Children ran nearby, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming trees. She heard a familiar voice and looked up. Miles. He was walking down the path with the same woman she had seen in the cafe. They held hands, and their laughter sounded light and natural. For a moment, Vivian felt her heart tighten, but instead of pain, she felt gratitude. He looked happy, genuine, and that was important. When their eyes met, he stopped. "Hi, Vivian," he said with a light smile, but without tension. "Hi, Mile," she replied, also smiling. His companion looked at Vivian with polite curiosity, but said nothing. "How are you?" he asked. "Good, she replied. "Working on myself. And it's quite interesting." He nodded, and in his eyes there was something like pride. That's great. You deserve it. Vivian wanted to say something more, but instead she just smiled. You too. They said goodbye and Miles left, leaving her with a feeling of light sadness mixed with relief. That night, Vivian wrote a letter she never intended to send. She just wanted to pour out everything she felt. Dear Miles, you were the best thing I couldn't keep. I destroyed what we had, and only now do I understand how patient and kind you were. You deserve happiness, and I'm glad you found it. Thank you for everything you gave me. You taught me that real love is not just feelings, but actions. I wish you all the best. With love, Vivian. She folded the letter and hid it in a drawer. It was her way of saying goodbye to the past and moving forward. A month later, Vivian received her first order as a designer. She created a cozy interior for a small cafe, and it brought her a joy she hadn't felt in a long time. She found herself, and this feeling became her new anchor. Now she knew love begins with loving oneself. If she ever met another person, she would be ready to love them right, without demands and expectations, just for who they are. She stood by the window looking at the sunset. Life was full of new opportunities, and she was ready to embrace them. And although part of her heart would always remember Miles, she had finally let him go. She was free. This story wasn't about a happy ending in the classic sense. It was about a new chapter, about the opportunity to start over. Because sometimes the most important thing is not to return to the past, but to learn to live in the present. Vivian closed her eyes and smiled. She knew something good awaited her, and for the first time in a long time, she truly believed it.